Good afternoon. I'm Jim Werbaneth, um, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the American Public University System, and also uh, adjunct faculty at the University of Arizona Global Campus, both in political science and social studies. And welcome to my presentation on the Battle of Gazala, Rommel's greatest flawed victory. This is the last Panzer victory in North Africa, but also considered Rommel's masterstroke. Although it was definitely flawed, the consequences could have been better in the long run, and both sides made terrible mistakes, but Rommel came up on top. Background for this is, of course, North Africa, which had an ebb and flow back and forth. After the Italian invasion of Egypt, the Italians were defeated and pushed back to the western border between Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. And following that, the Germans came in to shore up the Italians, but Rommel had other ideas. He wasn't just going to stay on the defensive. He drove forward past Tobruk and invested the city in a siege that was held by the Australians to great propaganda value for the British in the British Commonwealth. Operation Crusader at the end of 1941 defeated him badly, and Rommel had to retreat again to the border of Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. And the British managed to relieve Tobruk. It was actually a very major victory for the British, but it didn't last because after Rommel was driven back to Al Gazala, he came roaring back and stopped just short of Tobruk. It remained non-besieged, held by the British, in this case, South Africans as well, without any investment, no siege, and the front stabilized. And this was at the Gazala line, which you can see on this map. It's just to the west of Tobruk and extends down through Alam Hamam down to Bir Hakeim. Now, the status in May 1942 was as such. There was stability as both sides prepared for offensive operations. It was going to be a race to see who could strike first. Churchill was continually urging the Eighth Army to attack, which was very easy for him to do sitting in London, but conditions on the Gazala line were not quite conducive yet because, consistent with the Desert War, there was a need to build up supplies, replacements, spares for machinery, ammunition, you name it. You just couldn't go jumping off, although Rommel certainly did at times. But this was not the British way, and it wasn't probably all that smart either. Now, attack really was Erwin Rommel's modus operandi. There was no need to urge him. He would attack even when he was given a defensive mission, as he was in the spring of 1941. Now, what the British were doing, too, they were fortifying a line southwards from Gazala down to Bir Hakeim and laying minefields. They were going to be operating from behind a prepared defensive position. They were preparing to attack, but it would be from a what you consider a fortified base. And they were also determined not to subject Tobruk to another siege like the one lifted through Operation Crusader. There really wasn't much value in that, and it was better to preserve the forces in the field than bottled up in Tobruk. So let's go through the Axis leadership. The one that matters is General-Lieutenant Erwin Rommel. The Desert Fox. He had built up a myth of invincibility, a guy who struck when you least expected it, sometimes least expected by his own superiors, hard driving to the point that it became sometimes counterproductive. He was also personally brave. He liked to lead from the front, insisted that his generals, his subordinates, did so as well. He did not like the idea of chateau commanders, as we saw in World War I. Sometimes he would lose track of a battle because he was embedded with a company or even a platoon trying to get something done, so he would lose the big picture. But his approach generally worked, obviously, because you don't generate a myth of invincibility by screwing up. He was defeated in Operation Crusader. He got over aggressive. He had his drive to the wire. And at one point, the British commander wanted to retreat. He was overruled by his own superior, Sir Claude Auchinleck. And the British, by just staying in the battle, ended up defeating Rommel. He was the one who quit first. So Crusader became a victory. Tobruk was relieved, and he was driven back to the edge of Cyrenaica again. But in May of 1942, he was ready to launch Operation Venezia, or Operation Venice, which turned into the Battle of Gazala. He was always preparing to attack. And the whole question here is who would go first. One of the things that he did to prepare for Venezia was to borrow air power that should have been used to support attacks on Malta. The plan that had been agreed to by the Germans and the Italians was called Operation Hercules. They were going to launch a combined airborne and seaborne invasion of Malta, take control of the island, and get that thorn out of their side for good. Now, Rommel was able to borrow the air power that should have been used for that, and with the agreement that it would be turned back, and even if it would be returned, and even if Hercules was not initiated, then the Germans and Italians could neutralize Malta through air power and bombing alone. I consider this a big mistake, and so do many other historians. But Rommel borrowed the air power and never really gave it back. And as we'll see, he used the air power to sustain his advance after Gazala and did not do a very good job of it. He had a habit of stealing trucks, not just from the British, but also from his own Air Force. The British leadership. The commander in the Middle East was General Sir Claude Auchinleck, the Auk. He was the overall commander, not just responsible for the Western Desert, Libya, and Egypt, but also for Persia, Iraq, Syria. He had a wide range of responsibilities and therefore did not command the Eighth Army directly. Most of his service was in the Indian Army. Personally, I have a high regard for British officers who served in the Indian Army. They were linguists. They had a broad range of experience, small-scale colonial combat, and they were used to dealing with a polyglot army involving different cultures, which is what we also saw in the Western Desert, that the British had an army that was drawn from throughout the Commonwealth and even beyond, with Poles and Greeks and French serving in it eventually. So I actually have a fairly high degree of respect for Auchinleck and his background, even though the Germans and the Italians won at Gazala. Commanding the Eighth Army was Lieutenant General Sir Neil Ritchie. He was a staff officer under Auchinleck, and he took over the Eighth Army when Alan Cunningham was relieved with his failure of nerve and aggression during Crusader. It was actually a good decision by Auchinleck that won the battle, but Ritchie was not in Rommel's league by any standard. He was assistant chief of staff to Auchinleck when he took over the Eighth Army and ended up wearing two hats as the chief of staff and also Eighth Army commander. And as we dealt with yesterday with my presentation on Inchon and Ned Almond, having a combat commander who was also chief of staff is not real brilliant. That what you end up having is a guy who doesn't do either job to an optimal level. And I think that Ritchie was always, I don't want to say lacking, but he wasn't in the first division of desert commanders. One reason is that he had never commanded anything larger than a battalion. This is a staff officer, not a combat officer, and I think it showed. Now, Auchinleck actually had very good ideas on how to change the Eighth Army's practices, standards, and general modus operandi and organization. He placed a greater emphasis on combined arms than his predecessors had. When Operation Compass was launched by O'Connor and at the behest of General Wavell, the British tended to operate in small combined arms battle groups. This was very good from colonial warfare. It worked against rebels in Iraq, but it's not necessarily going to work that well against a first-class enemy. The Italians in 1940 were not a first-class enemy, so it worked against them. Auchinleck wanted the infantry and the armor and the artillery to cooperate and coordinate to a much higher degree. He increased the infantry and the armored divisions as a proportion to their strength. Now, a lot of amateurs look at World War II and think, okay, you have a panzer division, you have an armored division, it's all tanks. This is where its strength comes from. Not really. What it is having a balance. The Germans came very close to having the ideal balance of 1/3 infantry, 1/3 armor, 1/3 artillery. The Americans actually reached it, and I think American divisions, armored divisions, performed better because of it. They didn't have the best tanks. They didn't always have the combat experience and training that the Germans did. But what they set out to do, they tended to do very well. And part of it was because of this balance. And Auchinleck had learned the lessons from Rommel about having a balance between the various arms. That you get, it's like a rock, paper, scissors situation, that you get the best out of all three when they work together. And the weaknesses end up being reduced or minimized. Another thing was he wanted to avoid the piecemeal force commitments and tactics that the Eighth Army had shown before. Like I said, it worked against the Italians, but sending in penny packets of troops and tanks against Rommel and the Germans was not going to work. He wanted to use bigger forces and exploit the principle of mass and concentration. And this is central, it's elementary. Rommel caught it from the beginning. The British were slower on the uptake. And it did resemble the Axis best practices. Rommel did the same thing, commanding the Italians. You had divisions working together, but they were inhibited by the Italian levels of training, leadership, and the quality of their equipment. But it was something that applied to the Germans, and he extended it throughout his Panzer Army Africa. The phase one of the battle, the race to who's going to strike first, Rommel wins. He launches Operation Venezia. The first stage is an attack in the north by the Italians under Ludwig Krevel, who had been the commander of the Africa Corps earlier. And so you had a first-class German general leading these Italians. They weren't supposed to break through in the north. They were supposed to divert British attention, along with a feint by mechanized forces towards the center of the British line. This starts on the 26th of May, 1942. There's also supposed to be an abortive landing by Gruppe Hacker, a German force with combat engineers, infantry, and not a lot of mobility behind Tobruk. They cancel this, and Gruppe Hacker goes into the line as a regular infantry unit. Now, the key to this at the beginning was a sweep to the south by Africa Corps and two Italian mechanized divisions, the Ariete, which was armored, and Trento, which was a motorized infantry division. The Italians worked as partners with the Germans on this armored sweep. The Italians in the north were basically leg infantry. These were the guys that had the mobility, had the training, but not always the equipment. And they definitely were second-rank divisions, but owing to the weakness of the Africa Corps, Rommel could not rely just on Germans. And this is something that should be noted. Rommel did most of this with basically 3 German divisions. He had the 15th Panzer Division, the 21st Panzer Division, neither one of which was ever really up to the strength levels of the units that fought on the Eastern Front at this time or had fought in France. They were always struggling to reach a nominal strength and seldom reached it. And the 3rd Division was the 90th Light Division, motorized infantry, a predecessor of the Panzer Grenadier divisions of later in the war. But these were his striking force. And the Afrika Korps was the Schwerpunkt of the Axis Army in North Africa. Now, Rommel ran into a bunch of surprises here, and they were not pleasant. First of all, the fortified minefields of the Gazala line start in Sector B4 at the top of this map and go down to Bir Hakeim in Sector C2. This was a very long line of minefields with the fortified boxes, each one holding a British or South African infantry brigade, starting with the South African division in the north, the 1st South African division in the north, then the 50th Infantry Division from the British Army in the center. And this position of Bir Hakeim was held by a Free French brigade, including the foreign legionnaires. Now, the legionnaires would not want to surrender here because many of them were pre-war anti-Nazi Germans. Surrender was not really an option, plus you had the generally high quality of the Foreign Legion. And coupled with that, too, a desire to restore the honor of the French army. So Bir Hakeim was going to be a tough nut to crack, even without the fortifications. Rommel did not know how long the line went. He ran into the 5th Infantry Brigade in the south of the 3rd Indian Infantry Brigade of the 7th Division. They were in the south, and they slowed him down. That was an unexpected surprise. And of course, Bir Hakeim was initially trusted to the Italians to attack, and it was not something they were just going to be able to overrun without any thought. In fact, this is something that the Germans could not overrun quite easily. Rommel had very little idea of the British deployments, especially behind the Gazala line. He didn't know the Gazala line, and he didn't know what was behind it, but he went anyway. Usually, this is a recipe for disaster, and it's almost, in my mind, it's almost criminal negligence. The German reconnaissance, you would think, would be better, but German intelligence had a tendency to fail at the worst times. Consider D-Day. Well, here the German intelligence was highly imperfect, to put it mildly. Then there was technological surprise. The 8th Army was benefiting from the presence of new American M3 Grant tanks. The Grant does not have a great reputation. The Russians, when they took it for Lend-Lease, they called it a grave for 6 brothers. But it was the best tank in the 8th Army. Mounted a 37-millimeter gun in the turret, and on the right side in the sponson, you had a limited traverse 75-millimeter gun. Had a high profile, but it was dependable, and it had an enormous amount of firepower that the Germans had not encountered before. This came as a grave surprise to the Germans, and they were evenly distributed throughout the 8th Army, so it was very hard to find a place where the British had mechanized or armored forces where there weren't any Grants. Now, 2 of the brigades in the north, the Army tank brigades, the 1st and the 32nd, they were equipped with British infantry tanks, the Matilda and the newer Valentine. They were hard to stop. They had very good armor, but poor mobility, and the lackluster 2-pounder gun, which was gravely out of date by 1942 and could not fire high explosive ammunition. Well, it could maybe if they had it, but it was not. It was a very defensible tank, but immobile and relegated to infantry support as it was supposed to be. This is phase one. Going phase two, we go into the cauldron. The cauldron was in the sector of C3 and C4 of this map. This is where the German mechanized forces concentrated after the Red Run, with their backs to the Gazala line and the 150th Brigade of the 50th Infantry Division. And Rommel's lines of communication here were originally very difficult and partially cut. First of all, his trucks had to make an end run as well around Bir Hakeim and were subject to interference by the French. Secondly, you had the minefields and the 150th Brigade box to his rear. So he had a fortified British position right behind the main strike force of Panzer Army Africa. And he was able to cut gaps through the mines, largely at the beginning with the assistance of the Italians. They were the ones that did the heavy lifting. So he was able to get some supplies through there, but still he was in a very precarious position. What he did between the 30th of May and the 1st of June, though, was attack to his rear and destroyed the 150th Brigade and its box. This was decisive. In my view, this is where the battle started to be won. That this cleared his rear area and also cleared the supply lines through the minefields. And mind you, too, these minefields were not adequately covered by fire. For a minefield to really work, you have to have artillery, automatic weapons covering it to keep the other side from clearing paths. The British failed to do that. So they actually made this a little easier than it should have been for Rommel at his moment of greatest crisis. At the same time, too, they failed to launch a coordinated attack on the cauldron. They finally launched an attack, Operation Aberdeen, on the 5th of June, 1942, and this was followed by an Axis counterattack. It was not as coordinated as it should have been. Rommel was able to fend it off at great cost to the British, and then he was able to go on the attack again, which was the Rommel modus operandi. The third stage is a breakout to the British rear. You see in the red here, in the lower center left of the map, you see the red bulge there. That shows the British attack into the cauldron and the German and Italian advance out of it in their counterattack. In the process, too, once he broke out, Rommel sent the Germans to attack Bir Hakeim. That was overrun on the 10th of June. Most of the French got out, so the brigade was not destroyed, but the position was taken. And this cleared up a lot of problems as far as Rommel's logistics went and got rid of a very, very nasty problem to his flank and his rear. But the honor of the French army was upheld by the defenders. They left really when things got untenable, and they didn't surrender. So that was definitely a point of pride. And by the way, too, there's a bridge in Paris. It's called the Pont de Bir Hakeim to celebrate this. It's considered an important moment for French arms in World War II. Now, the subsequent Panzer Army Africa attacks on the Knightsbridge position and the 201st Guards Brigade worked. They stalled. They didn't go as fast as Rommel would have liked. What does? But they inflicted massive losses on the British armor. At this point, Rommel, in my view, has won the battle. But this is the point of running up the score. As Napoleon used to say, and Clausewitz did, the pursuit is where you make a victory worthwhile. This is the start of the exploitation pursuit phase. Now, at this point, the momentum is thoroughly in the hands of the Axis. The British never got through. They had never gotten inside of Rommel's decision cycle. They did not have the initiative, and here it's really starting to pay off for the Germans and the Italians that the British failed to do so. And the British are suffering for this his major lapse. In fact, Rommel at one point was very concerned. He was astonished that the British had so much strength. They had more than he did, and they never launched a decisive attack when he was in the cauldron. It was a bit here and a bit there, much different than what Auchinleck had wanted. So it shows the Eighth Army going back into bad practices rather than adopting the better ones of the Axis. As a result, the Eighth Army went on the verge of collapse, and they began a general retreat from the Gazala line on the 14th of June. Rommel's won. The British have lost. The British know it, and now they have to try to save what's left of the Eighth Army. After they lost most of their tanks, they've been demoralized, defeated in the field, and Tobruk is in danger. Phase 4 is the fall of Tobruk. My belief here is it was much more valuable to the Axis than it was to the Allies. And the Allies did not make the effort to save it that they did the year before. Its fortifications were in bad shape. These were built by the Italians. They were neglected. They were damaged from the earlier siege. This was not the fortress it had been the year before. Also, the minefields have been stripped to build the Gazala line. So these major obstacles were effectively gone. It's going to be much easier to breach the perimeter because of it. And it was defended primarily by 2 South African brigades. In practice, these guys were not up to the par of the Australians who had been there the year before. And I know there was a rivalry between South Africa and Australia in the Eighth Army. But in this case, the South Africans had lesser leadership under General Copper, and they were not as effective as the Australians had been. So the advantage here definitely goes with Panzer Army Africa. Now, the decision had already been made by Auchinleck that this was not going to be besieged. So it's basically an economy of force operation here to hold Tobruk. It's not a major objective of the British. And as a result, it surrendered on the 21st of June. This was definitely a setback for South Africa. They had lost 1/3 of their operational army. They had 2 divisions in the field, 6 brigades. 2 of them are now marching off into captivity. Now, Rommel at this point does what he does best, one of many things, and he drives to Egypt, to Mersa Matruh, and then to the eventual British stopping line at El Alamein. Now, Panzer Army Africa had been worn down to the point I don't think there was any hope of getting into the Nile Delta or Alexandria, but he always had that hope. At this point, it's more or less a vain, forlorn hope. And by the way, at this point, too, he should have returned his borrowed air power. He doesn't. He uses it to sustain his advance. And as a result, Malta is never invaded. Now, there are some reasons why the British failed, not just the reasons for Rommel's success, but this is one that the British had every reason to win, and especially considering Rommel's unpleasant surprises at the beginning and lack of intelligence, recipe for disaster that never happened. I'd like to spotlight here why the British failed. First of all, they failed to maintain the initiative. When they should have been attacking, they were too passive and let Rommel take the initiative, let him call the tune, and they would dance to it. Big mistake. Kind of like Stonewall Jackson, you don't want to give this guy a chance. And they gave him many chances, not just to recover in the cauldron, but they failed to even endanger him in the cauldron and allowed him to attack out of it. There was the decisive killer instinct that you need in armored warfare was pretty much lacking. They could not go in for the kill. I think maybe they wanted to, but they didn't have the practices. They did not have the initiative to do so. And as a result, they went in for a bunch of little drives, little efforts. Another thing was in the Gazala line, it was extended too far. Most of the boxes were not able to support each other. As the men of the 150th Brigade of the 50th British Infantry Division found out, they were on their own. Maybe they could have been relieved by a large-scale armored combined arms counteroffensive, but they were not going to get any support from the other two brigades to the north. They were too far away. And Bir Hakeim was out there in the middle of nowhere. I think if that had been held by anyone besides the French, it would have fallen a lot sooner. But this was not a well-designed position in a lot of ways. It was fortified, had minefields, but they weren't covered by fire either. Another reason is they had inferior tanks. The Crusader tank was, frankly, garbage. It was unreliable, had poor armor, had that by now thoroughly obsolete 2-pounder gun. And it really wasn't an even match for any of the German tanks. I don't even think the Panzer Kampfwagen 3H model with the short 50-millimeter gun, I think that was even superior to the Crusader. But the M3 Grant was a very unpleasant surprise for the Axis, and it was effective if used correctly, and was a potential battle winner in some ways for the British, especially since the Germans did not expect to see it. That lack of fire to cover minefields, that's an essential issue that the British failed on. And I think if the line had been shorter, they had artillery and automatic weapons to cover longer stretches of minefields, they would have made things a lot harder for Panzer Army Africa. Now, the overwhelming primary reason underlying everything else that I see here is a scale of thought. The Axis, and especially Erwin Rommel, thought of divisions as the primary maneuver units. Their way of thinking was always concentration, always combined arms, big units, overwhelming force. The British were still thinking of brigades, not divisions, as their basic maneuver units, a brigade being about 1/3 or 1/2 of a division. So they were never able to coordinate large-scale division-level attacks on any effective level at Gazala. They were sending a brigade. It was like sending a boy where you got it where to do a man's job. Against the Italians alone in 1940, it would have worked against rebels in Iraq or Somalia or someplace, but it's not going to work against Panzer Army Africa here, a first-class quality force led by one of the greatest generals of World War II. You got to think bigger, and the British were still thinking small in terms of brigades. They did kill a lot of German tanks. They killed a lot of Italian tanks, but they did not win the battle. Whatever losses they inflicted were irrelevant, considering they lost Tobruk, and the 8th Army it wasn't quite destroyed, but it was running away pretty fast. I really believe that if the British, especially the Corps commanders and Ritchie, had thought in terms of moving around whole divisions, concentrating them instead of sending in brigades individually, they could well have won this battle. But this was a scale of thinking that they were not quite up to yet. And remember, too, Auchinleck had been trying to get them to think this way in terms of balanced divisions acting together. He saw it work for the Axis. He wanted his forces to do it, but they were still on a learning curve. And remember, too, this is the British Army, which is more stubborn. It's one of their great strengths that they're stubborn in the face of the enemy, but sometimes stubborn in the face of their own commanders who want change. When they changed, they could go very fast, but they were not up to it at this point. They were still thinking in old terms and losing in old ways. Now, the consequences for the British were pretty bad. First of all, Auchinleck and Ritchie lost their jobs. And I think with Ritchie, especially for good reason, Auchinleck made the mistake of leaving Ritchie in command of the 8th Army. He should have gotten somebody else, or gone in and run things himself instead of using a proxy, as he did. He trusted Ritchie to do a man's job, and Ritchie performed a staff officer's job. And I think he was too passive. He did not have the force of personality either that was required. And Auchinleck paid for it too. Now, Ritchie was replaced by the commander of 13th Corps in the 8th Army, which was to the north of the Gazala line. It was mainly infantry with those Matilda and Valentine infantry tanks in the 2 Army tank brigades. Ritchie was replaced by William Gott, known as Strafer. He was commanded to the 8th Army, but was quickly killed in air combat by the Luftwaffe. And he was replaced in terms by Bernard Law Montgomery. Now, I am not a Monty fanboy by any means, but Monty was a far better choice in the long run. He was able to enforce a level of confidence, force of will upon the 8th Army, got them to fight his way, which I don't think Gott would have done. Gott was promoted from within, making the same mistakes, most probably, as he had seen others do before him. I think Gott was more of the same. And maybe it was a lucky move for the British that he was killed and replaced by Monty. My own view of Monty follows what Stephen Ambrose said. He was a pretty good general, but a thoroughly rotten human being. Americans who fought under him in the Bulge would certainly think so. But he was the right man in the right place to win at El Alamein. Churchill was in Washington at the time at the White House when he was informed of Tobruk's fall. And he admitted that he was terribly devastated by it. He had a lot of emotional investment, shall we say, in the port, even though his subordinates did not. And I think it's important, too, to remember that memories were fresh of the fall of Singapore. And that was not just a decisive moment in World War II in Southeast Asia. It was a decisive moment in the erosion of the British Empire and its aura of invincibility among the locals. Tobruk was more of the same again. And Churchill he took it hard. And being with Roosevelt when it happened, he was particularly embarrassed. Now, as a positive consequence, the Americans started stripping armor from their own divisions, especially the 1st and 2nd Armored, and sending it to North Africa under Lend-Lease to support the 8th Army. And as we see on the right side of the screen here on the transporter, we see an early model Sherman with a cast hull. This was going to be one of the most important weapons in North Africa from then on. You had a low velocity, medium velocity, maybe 75 millimeter gun in a rotating turret, unlike that sponson on the M3 Grant, which was basically that was a interim model before the Sherman could be introduced in the American and British armies. The Sherman was a much superior vehicle, one that got a lot of flack, shall we say, from its crews towards the end of the war because it did not really keep up with German technology. It was never a match for the German Panther. But as a sign of just how sound this design was, it was used by the Israelis through 1973 in the Yom Kippur War. It could be adapted, it could be upgraded. In 1942-43, it was the best tank in the desert when it had to be there. And the American initiative of stripping its own army of Shermans to give to the British, I think was a very far-reaching, it was definitely a move of foresight and wisdom, and it paid off at El Alamein. And as Churchill said about that battle, it wasn't the beginning of the end, but it was the end of the beginning. And after El Alamein, there were no more defeats and only victories. Hard victories, but it was the turning point. And Gazala set that up. Now for the Axis, Okay, next stop, El Alamein, which the British won. For the consequences for the Axis, we see Rommel here on the right, shaking hands with the little mustache bastard who gave him his field marshal's baton. Rommel became one of the top dogs in the German army, propaganda tool. He earned it through this massive victory over the Eighth Army and was a field marshal, not just another general with good public relations. Now, it paid off for him personally. Now, he did retain the air assets that were lent to him for Operation Venezia, and this was a problem. Rommel did not like to give things back, and he was very stubborn, something that you need on a good commander, but he was stubborn. He was a scrounger when it came to other people's resources. And one of the things that Robert S. Ellers writes about in his book, The Mediterranean Air War, is that he had this really bad habit of appropriating not just air assets, but the ground transport that came with their base areas. He would basically steal their trucks to have them transport the Wehrmacht when they were advancing, and it made it very difficult for the air power to keep up with his army. So when he ran into the Desert Air Force, which had a much better record of logistics, the Luftwaffe in North Africa could be outclassed. It could be outnumbered, not because they didn't have enough aircraft. They just didn't have enough trucks to haul the ground personnel, the spare parts, and the fuel forward. In this way, Rommel could be very short-sighted. And part of this is because he kept, especially the 10th Air Fleet, Operation Hercules was canceled. And while the Panzer Army Africa won at Gazala and captured Tobruk, Malta remained in British hands. I don't think that was much of a trade. So in some ways, Rommel was able to win a great victory, but what came after it, kind of like Pearl Harbor, you win the victory, but what comes afterward is not what you expected, and you get into a law of diminishing returns that you actually set up the enemy to defeat you in the future. Now, let's get to the recommended games on this, because it is a battle that has been covered extensively by war games, including ones that cover North Africa in general. They'll usually have or often have a Gazala scenario in there. So I narrowed it down to 3 that I can recommend. First one is Rommel at Gazala. This was designed by moi, and it was published by Lock and Load in the 2nd edition in 2015. I had a self-published, desktop-published version that I put out 9 years earlier. And then when Dave Heath and Lock and Load came to me and said, we want to do it as a professional version with better graphics and a really cool map, I said, sure. And so we made a deal. And this version of Rommel at Gazala is the one that you can buy today. It does not have the battle manual in it that the original self-published version does, which I modeled on the Avalon Hill approach. But this is still a good game. It's very simple. And part of it wasn't just to do a simple game, but also to show aspiring designers that anybody could design a war game. It just didn't have to be Campaign for North Africa. You weren't going to wind up on the Big Bang Theory with your game, but you could do a game well within people, the average war gamer, the average historians, the average history buffs range of talents and abilities. And by the way, when I designed this, this was my 3rd game that I designed. But I wasn't a seasoned war game designer, you could say that, and I was not a degreed military historian yet, that I was more like the average gamer at this point. Now I've got a lot more experience and training, especially through my master's in military history. So you could say that if I could design this, anybody can design a perfectly viable war game. Just stay within your abilities and keep it simple for the customers. Second one I can recommend highly is Triumphant Fox, designed by the German designer and Bundeswehr veteran Dirk Blenneman. This is a much more advanced game. You do not have dates associated with game turns. So what you have is activations, a lot of chaos. That a game turn could be hours or it could be several days. So they don't assign a specific time frame to each turn, which was a little off-putting at first for me. But it's still an excellent game, much more advanced than mine. It came out much earlier even than the first edition of Rommel Gazala. But I think that Dirk did an outstanding job on this. And this is more for the advanced class, the gifted kids. But I highly recommend it, and it's really grown on me over the years. Also, to the third one that I'd be really remiss for historical purposes in the history of the hobby is Tobruk. We've all had Tobruk. We've all owned this game. My copy is much more messed up than this cover that I got off of Board Game Geek. It's worn. I've had a huge amount of fun with it. It's a tactical game about Gazala that covers basically all the elements of the larger battle in smaller scale, on it with individual tanks and infantry squads. Avalon Hill did this in 1975. It was designed by Harold Hoke, and it was one of the first games to really try to integrate mathematical systems analysis. It remains advanced. It remains very detailed. Still, it's created a whole range of Tobruk junkies, and I think it's very important in the history of wargaming in tactical games. Avalon Hill finally put this out of print when West of Alamein came out as their advanced squad leader module on the desert. But for the history of the battle, it's worthwhile. As the history of wargaming, it's absolutely vital. Now this is a partial list of references, and I was probably remiss. I thought about this as I was putting this together. I didn't put in anything by Jack Green and his friend Alessandro. I can't pronounce the last name. I'm sorry. But I didn't put their books in. They're very charitable towards the Italian army. And I should have put them in, definitely, but I was running out of room. The books I can recommend here, Winston Churchill, of course. He's kind of self-serving, but he's the most important figure in both World War II and it's the writing of its history. So Volume 3 of the Second World War, The Hinge of Faith. The Hinge of Fate is very worthwhile. That's a good starting point, as is the Osprey campaign book, Gazala 1942, Rommel's Greatest Victory. That's one of the better Osprey books, and they've overcome their original editing issues early in the series. Thomas E. Grice, The Second World War, Europe and the Mediterranean. That's from the West Point Military History series. And it's a very good general history of World War II in the West. One that I always kind of gag when I put it on the references is David Irving's The Trail of the Fox. I have a very low opinion of David Irving as a person. He can come and sue my ass like he did with Deborah Lipstadt, but he does deny the Holocaust. He describes himself as a moderate fascist. I can be a moderate fascist. It's like being a part-time serial killer. But The Trail of the Fox is a very good biography of Erwin Rommel. And it doesn't have the stink of Holocaust denial and excuses for Hitler that you might see in some of his other books. And I can't think of a wargamer who has not read David Irving at one point or another. I do not accept his works as valid sources for my college classes. I tell them right out and why. But The Trail of the Fox is probably his best work, and it is very good reading on the Desert War and specifically on Gazala. Friedrich von Mellenthin's Panzer Battles is good. But remember, he is a German staff officer who went to South Africa and makes tons of excuses and is a firm adherent of the Clean Wehrmacht myth. My game was based largely on the research done by Albert A. Nofi in The Desert Fox, Rommel's campaign in North Africa. That's an S&T article from the Trail of the Fox game issue. Very good. But then again, it's written by Al Nofi, so what do you expect? You know you're going to get the best. Brian Parrott's book Desert Warfare is a very general overview, but has a very good chapter on Gazala. It was important to the design of my game. And then you have 4 sources here by me. And I didn't realize how much I'd actually written on all this. I have 2 general articles here. One called Helpful Conduct by the Enemy, which that's not my title. That's the one that the editors put in from World War II magazine in May 1992. I did not pick that title. I never would. I believe I called it Decision at Gazala, but they paid me. They got to rename it. I have 2 readily available articles on the Avalanche Press website on the Matilda tank, the infantry tank that really shone earlier before Gazala, and one on the M3 Grant, the wrong tank in the right place. Those are both available on Avalanche Press. And now out of print because it's not in the battle manual was not put in the lock and load version of Rommel Gazala. Was an article called Rommel Gazala, The Last Desert Victory. That's no longer available, but if you have the original first edition of the game, you can read it. Finally, the one I really should spotlight here is Robert S. Eller's The Mediterranean Air War, Air Power and Allied Victory in World War II. This was published in 2015, so it's fairly recent scholarship, unlike Churchill or Mellonton. This deals extensively with the entire Mediterranean Air War and right through the Soviet victory in the Balkans and American and British efforts in Italy. But he covers the use of Luftwaffe logistical assets by the Panzer Army Africa very extensively and shows that the British respect for the Desert Air Force's trucks paid off in the long run. Highly recommend this. So we've got a couple minutes left here, 7, I think. And I'm sorry, Jack, and I'm sorry, Alessandro, I didn't get your works in here, but I can recommend them highly. Please go out and do a Google search, everybody, and get them off of Amazon if you wish. If they're available, get them off of any place, just read them. But when I was doing the review of the references here, maybe the dog was jumping on me. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I just had a brain fart, but I didn't put them in, even though I put in David Bloody Irving. So that's basically the end. Does anybody have any questions? We've got a few minutes here.
Jim, I wasn't seeing any pop up in the Q&A there. Also, as a note, your camera seems to have frozen. Like you haven't moved in several minutes. So
okay.
I'm pretty sure you're still alive and that this isn't just an animatronic recording for a mannequin that you have sitting in your place.
Yeah, you just couldn't shut me up.
But
I don't know what happened.
Hold on. We're going to try and fix this with your camera real quick here. Let's remove. Let's add back to the stage.
No, it looks like I'm drooling on myself.
Yeah, it does. Hold on.
Yeah.
Maybe stop and restart your camera and see if that makes a difference. Okay. But in any event, there's like 3 minutes left in all of this. So it's not essential that we get something that doesn't look like a mugshot. Out of you.
I look like a floater out of the Allegheny River.
Yeah, a little. I was trying to be polite about it, but you went there first. So Jeff is saying, no questions, but thanks for the info. So I do want to know, I did have a copy of Jim's game, and I was actually going back to my shelves to go look and was going to hold it up and kind of wave it at everybody. But I think it got swapped off for somebody else at the Armchair Dragoons Fall Assembly back in October. when we had the swap table set up for folks to, kind of trade some things in and out. And I think that's one of the outbound ones that somebody snatched up in a hurry because like, oh, cool, let me grab that one. So it went to someone more likely to play it than me. I've played it a couple of times. I had a good time with it, but it's probably not going to hit my table again just because North Africa is not a key area of interest for me. But I'm glad it found a new home with somebody that's happy to sling dice over it. So, so as I noted a few minutes ago in the chat, so we're gonna grab that reference sheet from Jim. We'll have cut and paste and send it over to me as a text, as text info that I can paste into the text channel on the Discord for Jim's presentations. So that way, if folks want to go look up the references, they can find them there.
Yeah, and if you'd like, you can actually take my end my video with my floating dead face there. You can take that out of YouTube. I wouldn't mind that.
I don't know that I can. Especially not do it and leave the audio in place. So
yeah.
Well, we stalled for a couple of minutes here. We didn't get any questions from the audience. We've got a half a dozen-ish people watching, so we do appreciate you guys being here and hope you're having a good time at the ACDC. Those of you that are watching this like a year and a half, 2 years later, you're welcome to throw a comment on the YouTube video below. We might see it and be able to track Jim down for an answer, but no guarantees. We'll do what we can. Otherwise, this is your cue to attend the next ACDC live over MLK weekend every year and come join us for our online convention where you'll get a chance to actually interact live with our speakers for things like this. So,
also too, I should note, I share these with my students in many of my classes. So
cool.
It's like a sign, this is what professors can do if you want to get into the field. And some of them are military history majors too. So those are the ones who are particularly interested at American Military University.
Those are the guys we need to talk to you about having them show up for the Origins War College or show up at future ACDCs to come talk to us or something along those lines. So, cool. Well, audience, we're at the end of our 1 hour of time here. The ACDC is starting to wind down. We got a couple of games still going on. I think Atlantic Chase is about to spool up and one or two others starting later today. We do still have the panel this afternoon on the American War for Independence. And then our sort of closing happy hour that we're keeping within the Discord this time around, instead of putting it out on the YouTubes. We're going to keep this one kind of in-house inside the wire. Thank you all for being here. Jim, thank you very much for being on a frozen camera. We really appreciate it. But it was a great talk, and it's always fun to hear you sharing that historical knowledge. So thank you, folks. Appreciate it, and we'll catch you guys next time.
Okay. Thanks, Brent.